So compression. Compression is normally the very first bit of processing, the very first effect you throw on a vocal. And what it does is, it's almost like having your hand on the volume control, but it effectively makes the overall volume of the vocal more consistent. In fact, it's much better understood visually, and that's what I've got loaded up in front of you. The top vocal is the uncompressed original vocal, and then the two vocals below are the same vocal but compressed, albeit in two different ways. Now, an important thing to note here is that all three of these vocal clips are reaching the same level on the level meters. In fact, I can show you that. Just reset the three channels. See how they're all peaking at exactly the same level? However, the clips themselves do look rather different. The compressed clips, this one and this one, are first of all louder, but they're also a more consistent loudness. Another way of looking at this is that compression reduces the difference between the loudest point and the quietest. It changes the dynamic range. This difference between the loudest point and the quietest is called the dynamic range. And so compression reduces this dynamic range. Let me show you how they sound. So this is the uncompressed, the original vocal.
Take it back to the old school. Take it back to the old school. Take it back to the old school. Take it back to the old school.
And a compressed version of that.
Take it back to the old school. Take it back to the old school. Take it back to the old school. Take it back to the old school.
See how it's louder and more dynamically consistent? That's because of compression. I'll compare again. It's really important you can not only see the difference between a compressed vocal and an uncompressed vocal, but you can also hear the difference.
Take it back to the old school. 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 Take it back to the old school.
So naturally, the question then becomes, when do you need to compress and when don't you need to compress? Now, you can always compress for creative reasons, but whether or not you need to compress depends on the source material. If the source vocal has not been compressed, in other words, it's just a raw vocal from a recording, then you absolutely will need to do some compression. The human voice is naturally very dynamic, there's a big dynamic range, and therefore to get that natural vocal to fit alongside a synthesizer or a bass line, or just get it sitting in a dynamically flat dance track, it simply needs to be compressed. However, one thing to note though is that the large majority of sample pack vocals you can download from sample pack websites and such will already be compressed, and therefore if you're going to do any compression, it's purely going to be for creative reasons. And finally, one thing I do want to quickly reinforce before I show you how I did this compression is that you normally want to do this compression before you throw on your other effects, such as reverbs or delays or bit crushers, distortion, whatever it is. It's almost like you need to compress the vocal first of all to get it in the right ballpark such that you can then work on it properly. But let me show you how I did this compression. Now, you may have noticed I have two different versions of the compressed vocal. The reason I've done it twice is that my favorite vocal compressor, Gain Reduction Deluxe. The reason is you can simply throw this plugin on and it literally does all the hard work for you. There are no fiddly settings, it's designed for vocals, and by default it does very aggressive vocal compression, which is what I normally want. It's worth noting though you can ease off on the compression with the slay parameter.
Take it back to the old school. 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 Take it back to the old school.
And I just love it. It's fantastic and takes all the stress out of doing vocal compression. But I will give you another example just to show you the sort of thing you might do. And that is using Manic Compressor. I don't want to spend too long talking about every single parameter on a compressor and the sort of situations you might use it, because you could probably do an entire hour-long course just on using a compressor. But what I will do is just run through this specific example to give you an idea. First of all, I'm going to turn down the threshold, which is the point at which the compression starts, say -45. Should do the trick. And then increase the ratio, simplistically how much compression happens above the threshold, the higher number being a stronger amount of compression.
Take it back to the old school. Take it back to the old school. Take it back to the old school. Take it back to the old school.
All the way to 100, which is nearly limiting. I'll also quicken up the attack so the transients don't slip through.
Take it back to the old school. Take it back to the old school. Take it back to the old school. Take it back to the old school.
And finally, I'll choose a different compressor mode. Taking note that you tend to hear the biggest differences between these modes when you're doing the most aggressive compression, like in this example. But see if you can hear the difference between these modes as I flick through them. Hopefully you can hear that each of these has their own character, their own personality.
Take it back to the old school. 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 Take it back to the old school.
The only thing left to do now is bring up the level of this compressed vocal, which I can do in a few different ways, but I'll just bounce the channel or freeze it. Flatten, and then I'll normalize this clip using the consolidate shortcut in Ableton, and I'll bring it up to the same level, -1, as the other form of compressed vocal. And there you have it, a fully compressed vocal, perfect and ready to be further manipulated and processed. Thanks for watching.